audio.
One of the traits that is essential for climbing at your limit or pushing your limits at the red is being able to climb through the pump, which is one part physical, but it's a big part mental.
Hey y'all, welcome back to the Strollo Climbing Show. It's me, Ryan, and I could not be more hyped to bring this episode to you. A climber's guide to the Red River Gorge. Obviously, this is my home crag, and I talk about it incessantly. If you're listening to this, maybe you've climbed at the Red, or maybe you just feel like you've been climbing at the Red, living vicariously through my struggles and sometimes sends out there on that iconic sandstone. And today we've got a couple of absolute legends to chat through all things Red River Gorge with coaches Eric Hörst and Kris Hampton, a couple of guys who have logged many, many years and hundreds, thousands of routes and hours out here at the Red. And then I bring my little Gumby perspective along the way. In this episode, we talk about when to come, where to stay on all budgets, where to eat on all budgets, how to train for the pump, tactics to perform your best, how to protect the send on that steep sandstone, and then we break down our favorite routes, some of them classics and some of them kind of hidden gems, all the way from 5'9 to 5'14. This climber's guide is going to get you psyched and hopefully very well prepared to come out to the Red, whether it's a short trip or an extended one, to do your best and just have a ton of fun out here in Kentucky. So before we dive into this interview, let me just give like a quick little overview of the Red, of the geology and the history here for those who have not visited. So the Red River Gorge, or the Red, as most of us just lovingly truncate, is tucked into the Daniel Boone National Forest out here in eastern Kentucky. It is one of the most iconic climbing destinations in the U.S. So geologically, it's a canyon system. It's carved into the Corbin Sandstone, which is a 300 million year old formation famous for its very iron-rich color, its steep walls, and its incredibly unique features. I'm talking about pockets, huecos, sweeping overhangs, shapes that have been created by eons of water and wind erosion. And what that means is it makes for some of the most aesthetic and powerful climbing anywhere in the world. And a global destination it is. Every autumn, I run into people from all over the world, people from Japan and Germany and Britain and Australia and South America and all over the United States that come to the Red to enjoy this incredibly beautiful rock and the steep, pumpy climbing in and out of those caves. Now, climbers have been climbing to the Red since like the 60s or 70s, putting up early trad lines, but around the 80s, and certainly by the 90s is when the Red really exploded as a sport climbing destination. Early visionaries like John Brona and Porter Gerard, and just too many to list. There's a load. We actually talk about a handful in this episode. They put up some fantastic routes at the early crags, and from there it just has exploded. And just recently, a huge land acquisition is going to create what could be another 1,000 climbs at the Red. So there's a few thousand climbs already, more coming online. I would love to climb with you. Coming up in just about a week and a half at Rocktoberfest, another Red River Gorge staple, one of the longest running rock climbing festivals in the country. We're hitting our 25th year of Rocktoberfest this year, and I'm going to be kicking it off with a live podcast from iconic Miguel's Pizza. Oh, we talk a lot about Miguel's in this episode here. So I'm going to be doing a live podcast with, you guys, check out this lineup. Emily Harrington, Kai Leitner, and Anna Hazelnut. We're going to be out in the pavilion there at Miguel's on the Wednesday of Rocktoberfest. That's Wednesday, October 8th. It's going to be happening in the evening, probably sometime around 7 p.m. We've got a huge amount of prizes that we're going to be raffling off. Then we're going to do that live interview and hanging out for some pizza and some beer. So come on out on October 8th. Meet up with me and those climbers to kick off Rocktoberfest. You can swing over to the RRGCC website to grab your tickets for that. I will put a link in the show notes. And now, let's get you prepared for Rocktoberfest or any trip that you're going to take out to the Red. Let's kick things off right now with Eric Hörst and Kris Hampton. Yeah, guys, I'm excited. I'm excited to bring the both of you together because, together you bring an incredible amount of experience and perspective, not just as climbers and coaches, but also specifically Red River Gorge climbers and coaches. And that is the topic of this entire episode. For the listener, you're probably like, why are they talking about the red again? And it's because it's freaking awesome.
There's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, it's such a good climbing area. And if we enjoy this conversation, maybe we'll do more for other climbing areas. But the logical place to start here is the home crag for me and for the both of you for quite some time, at least, the Red River Gorge. And so I think that's probably a good place to start, actually, is to talk a little bit about just your history and your experience and your impressions of the Red River Gorge. And then we'll talk about a bunch of specific topics. So, Kris, let's start with you, because I think you date back the furthest here at the Red River Gorge, have the most experience as a Red River Gorge climber. So tell us about that. When did you start climbing here, and what's been your experience here at the Red?
I think the first time I went to the Red, actually, I suspect Eric probably went to the Red way before I did.
I went there in 95.
Oh, well, that's probably the same year I went there for the first time, was 95.
Nice.
And
I was in high school.
Nice. And I don't recall like what the first trips were like, other than I know we went to Military Wall, left flank, roadside. Like those were the crags back then. And there weren't a lot of routes that were easier than 510. So you kind of got thrown into the deep end pretty quickly. But I do recall, I was thinking about this morning, the first time I ever tried a 512 was the same day that Bohica saw its first ascent. So I just happened to be there watching Jeff Mole climb Bohica. So it was, the Red was already established as a great area. It had great crags, but the Mother Lobe was just being developed at the time that I was, really coming up.
Oh, man. What a cool time to be a part of it. And Jeff Mole, coincidentally, as I was working on the Force, he was working on some stuff over at the dark side. So we actually climbed next to each other for quite some time for a season there. Absolute crusher and a good Red River Gorge legend. We can talk a little bit about some of the, the major influences on Red River Gorge climbing as well. But Kris, before we kick it over to Eric, just what does the Red mean to you? Like without, we'll get into a lot of specifics in this conversation, but just, when you hear the Red River Gorge, when you think about the Red, what is that for you?
Wow. I mean, it still has a huge piece of my heart. I haven't been there in 7 or 8 years at this point, but
Wow.
Everything I learned as a climber, I learned there initially. And as a rock climber specifically, I think I'm a much better rock climber than I am a gym climber. And I owe a lot of that to the Red. And it's seen so many phases of my life from, young party kid. We used to go clubbing on Friday nights, and then we'd get in the car and drive straight to the Red and just sleep in our car, at the rest area or at the roadside parking lot. And then we'd hike to the crag. I'd always forget my approach shoes. So we'd hike to the crag in our dress shoes from the night before and our club clothes, and we'd go climbing. So from that era all the way to being a dad, being a husband, and being a much more responsible human than I was as a club kid. And from, trad to hardcore sport, I'd say hardcore trad to hardcore sport. It's seen so many phases of my life. Yeah. And helped me through them, I would say.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You really have had such an incredible history at the Red, and we'll probably touch on some of the hardcore trad in this. I predominantly focus on sport climbing, but I am excited for a trad season at the Red coming up here. And it wasn't too long ago that I was out in Lander and you and I were able to tie in at Iris. And you mentioned perhaps this is the year that you might come back to the Red. Is that still on the
it's still percolating.
List?
Yeah, it's still percolating. If I can make the time, because I have a 3-year-old right now and my wife works at the schools, so it's tough to get out in the fall, but I think I might be able to make it work, at least for a short trip. Do the not suggested at all 5 days on in a row and jet out of there.
Oh, amazing. Oh, I hope we can make it happen. Eric, let's kick it over to you there. It sounds like you and Kris kind of mid-90s first trip out here. Tell us about your impressions of the Red and what your relationship is now at the Red River Gorge.
Yeah, well, any old-timer climber of my generation knows that I was a New River Gorge climber. Being a Pennsylvanian, closer trip to West Virginia, I was brought in pretty early, before there were any bolts at the New River Gorge. And so I kind of walked in there in the mid 80s at the beginning of the golden age and was able to participate in putting up a couple of hundred first ascents. And so from 1986 to 2000, let's say, I climbed almost exclusively at the New with, some trips to Europe or out west. But Porter Gerard, who of course we all know he's a legend at the Red, he would come to the New, as would, Doug Reed spent a lot of time at the New, and they talked about this Red River Gorge area. This is like in 1989, 1990. And I didn't really pay much attention to it. Nobody did, because in 89 or 90, I think it was more trad climbing at the Red than sport climbing. The original Spiral guidebook had just a littering of sport routes in it. So I heard a lot about it from Porter and from Doug, but I was too busy doing my thing at the New River Gorge, which is rightfully a world-class area itself. There you go. There's that original guidebook.
Kris has no surprise because Hampton's got quite the library. Yeah. He's holding up the original spiral-bound guidebook right there. So
in any case, I didn't jump on, and travel to the Red at first word of it. It took a few years. And by 1995, I had heard enough stories about these huge caves and steep routes, something that the New River Gorge didn't have. The New River Gorge is more vertical with some roofs. But I heard stories of these big caves, specifically the Mother Lode. So we committed to doing a trip there in 1995. And I think at that time, the Mother Lode, because it was being developed, was still kind of secret. So, in that first visit, it was like Kris said, it was roadside. Horn, I think, was the very first place I climbed. And then, military left flank, those areas, all the early Porter Gerard, Doug Reed, and other type areas. But Mother Lode is being developed. Gold Coast and Dark Side hadn't even been discovered yet. Hugh Loeffner found those, I think, in like 1999. So, much of the Red wasn't even yet discovered in that time. But the Mother Lode was certainly noteworthy, just totally novel for United States climbing at that time to have routes that steep. And one little piece of trivia that Kris maybe knows more about, but he mentioned Bohica. The original routes there on the Madness Cave ended at bolts at 80 feet because back then they only made 60-meter ropes. And so, to get down, you had to stop at about 80 or maybe 100 feet of climbing. And so that's why those routes like Bohica, Flower Power have anchors at 80 or 90 feet. And then later with the longer ropes were stretched to the top. Does that sound about right, Kris?
Yeah, that's correct. And some of the midway anchors have been removed and some haven't. So some of the old names did not persist and some of the old anchors went away.
Yeah. So there's been an evolution there. It's been 25 or 30 years, since those original Mother Lode routes were put in. But that was my first visit. And I came back, I think, again in 97 and again around 2000. But just to kind of complete the story here, I didn't really become enamored of and a regular at the Red until we had kids. When we had kid climbers, when Cam and John were 5, 6, 7, we were introducing them to outdoor climbing and eventually to lead climbing. And the New River Gorge, which was my area, my home area, there couldn't be a worse place for kid climbers because there's big reaches, there's no intermediates, the routes are really sporty, they're vertical, so the falls can be nasty at times. And conversely, the Red River Gorge tends to be a little more generously bolted. There's almost always intermediates for shorter climbers. And so as our kids began to lead climb, we started to go to the Red more and more and more. So that kind of became our home area. Now, my kids are adults now and actually live out west. And Kris probably sees my sons more than I do now. But my wife and I still go to the Red. And it's where I want to grow old or grow older, I guess. Because it's a good old guy area too. It's not only a good kid area, but it's a good old guy area. So there's something for everyone at the Red.
You touched on a few things there that for the listener who maybe hasn't visited the Red and those who have, you recognize what kind of makes the Red is this characteristic like steep cave climbing where they're the kind of quote unquote the biggest holds that you've ever fallen off of. And a lot of great intermediates. My daughter, who's 7, is able to climb a lot of the things that I'm just like messing around on because she's grabbing little intermediate ripples and the falls are fun and safe and into space. And when I came out here, I started climbing out west, and it was, trad, granite, kind of slab climbing. And so for me, it actually took some getting used to, not just the climbing style, that took a lot of getting used to. We'll get into how to best prepare for Red River Gorge climbing in a second. But the mental game for me, actually, it was a little scarier falling into space because I wasn't accustomed to that. I was so accustomed to taking slab falls and getting my feet up and spiking a little bit, but that kind of felt safe to me. And then coming out to the red and like really trusting a bolt to bounce into space took some time, but now it is much more comfortable and feels much safer than taking slab falls. So for the listener who hasn't visited, you've seen pictures, you've seen videos. It is an absolutely gorgeous area. And it's shocking to me, you guys are talking about kind of mid to late 90s, where there were maybe a handful of crags kind of around the area there. Maybe the route numbers were in the hundreds, and now we're into the thousands, and even more coming online with the recent massive land acquisition that I'm sure many people have heard about, kind of a public-private collaboration, which will open up, who knows, another 1,000 routes maybe. So it's a smorgasbord of opportunity out here. And there is some vert stuff. There's definitely trad, and there's plenty of cave climbing. And Kris, maybe this is a good opportunity before we kind of dive into some specifics about when to come and how to prepare and all of that. You've climbed all over, and Eric, you have as well. So I'll get your perspective on this. But for someone who hasn't visited the Red River Gorge, can you give a sense for what that experience is going to be like for them when they get out here for the first time?
Yeah, I think the first thing to prepare yourself for is that a 10-year-old is probably going to flash a project in front of you. And your ego needs to be ready for that, period. It's happened to me a lot. And other than that, I think it's, Eric mentioned the pump, and it's a real thing. Generally speaking, if you're a Western U.S. climber, you've probably spent more time on your feet than on your arms. Not always true, of course, but by and large, the rock in the red is more continuously steep than what you're going to find in the Western U.S. So you're going to get really, really pumped. And I think that's something you have to wrap your brain around. And it's a slippery slope. Eric coined the term pump lust, and that's a real thing in the Red River community. And I'm going to bring that up again later because I want to talk about it a little bit. But the pump is the main thing you need to be aware of in the red.
Oh yeah, the pump is real. That is for sure. For me, and by the way, for the listener, you probably know at this point in time, but I haven't been out here for very long. I've been climbing out here for, I guess, maybe like 7 years now. So I'm still trying to embrace the pump lust, if you will. And we'll do a whole section here in just a minute on preparation. But I want to talk about the best seasons and like the kind of the seasonality of the red and the best times to come out here for those who are listening who might be thinking about making a trip. And we probably all have perspectives on this. I'm a local now. Eric is a semi-local, comes in from Pennsylvania and spends extended periods of time here during what he considers for himself to be the best seasons. And then, of course, Kris, you were climbing year round. You were climbing in the worst conditions and the best conditions. Yeah. So probably a lot of good perspectives here. Eric, from your point of view, how do the seasons break down at the red?
Yeah, well, in my previous life, I was a weatherman, so I know a lot about the weather. Yeah. And I'm really good at looking at the weather patterns and following the forecast, as a lot of climbers are. Because weather's just so crucial to being able to climb your best and have a good time. That being said, as an Eastern climber, you just can't wait for perfect weather or you would never climb. So, whereas out west, people do wait for perfect weather. And so long story short is, I was a weekend warrior going to the red or to the new. And so if the forecast looked mainly dry, we'd do the drive or we would climb. For people traveling farther than that, like people that need an airplane to get to the red, or you're going to come to the red for a month or more, I steer people very strongly to the autumn season, obviously, because in most of the Northern Hemisphere, or maybe around the world, that's the climbing season, the optimal conditions. So when I have friends coming in from Europe, let's say, I steer them to October and November. You could try to do the spring, but the spring is unsettled, and there can be a brilliant week, and then there can be a week where it showers every day. And it can be a real roller coaster ride. It could be sunny and 60 one day and snow showering the next day. That's the spring in the mountains of the eastern United States. And, as you know, as a local, winter, there can be an amazing day here or there, but it's not dependable enough that you would want to fly in from a distant location to climb there in the winter. I think there would just be a lot of wasted days. But if you're local and can strike on the sunny and 40 or 50 degree days, that's attainable. So, it's year-round climbing for sure. People climb there in the haze and humidity of the summer. The holds are big. The routes are steep and shaded. You can do it. It's not the most pleasant experience. I'd rather be at 9,000 feet in Wyoming in July than at the Red, but it can be done. So yes, year-round climbing, but if people are going to invest in a big trip to the Red, do it in the autumn. Of course, the rest of the world is there also. So that's right. The drawdown of the autumn season.
Kris, what would you like to add to that?
The only thing I'll add is I totally agree with Eric, especially if you're on a trip, make it the good months. But if you're local, I think climbing in some of the bad conditions and just learning what you can do and learning how to adapt to those conditions is a really smart thing, especially if you're going to go on, if you're the normal working person who has a 2-week vacation and you take your vacation to Colorado or California or wherever, and you have not perfect weather, you still want to be able to perform in those conditions. Your weekends, if you're a weekend warrior, you want to be able to perform in those conditions. So I think if you're local, take advantage of some of the bad conditions. I'm not saying climb all summer in the Red. That's a bad idea. Unless you're an off-width climber, because those off-widths blow cool air out in the summer. But we're not going to go there. But take advantage of those bad conditions and just learn to adapt to them, I think is a good play if you're a local.
I've allotted you 2 instances of saying the word off-width in this conversation, Kris, and so that was one.
We can get them out of the way early.
Yeah, I totally concur. I will say that as a local, I've had some really fun days out there this summer. And for the listener who hasn't visited, there's so much climbing, and because of the caves, the way they horseshoe around, you can find shade in the when you need shade, and you can find sun when you need sun. And I have had amazing days in August, and I've had amazing days in January, and it just kind of depends. Now, for me, when I'm trying to perform, my ideal month is kind of mid-November to mid-December. That's like if I were to pick like a 30-day window, because I like it really cold. In fact, I've had some of my best days in January and February, but to Eric's point, they're so unpredictable and few and far between. I wouldn't want to necessarily book a 2-week trip in January because you could just get snowed out. But on a sunny wall, like when I was working on Jesus Wept, or when I was working on Stain this past winter, where they get full sun, both of those, I was very comfortable in t-shirt climbing in the mid-20s. And it's just the way that rock collects the sun. Left flank's another one. There's some warm walls out there that will shock you how hot they feel at 50 degrees. So you kind of want the really cool temperatures. But it's just so beautiful when the leaves are turning colors. And if you're going to come, and especially if you're coming with a family and you want to hike and really enjoy it, kind of that late October to through November is just such a beautiful time. There's plenty of fun to be had in the summer as well. If you just kind of knock the grade down a little bit, knock your expectations down a little bit, and paddle on some bigger jugs.
Well, and there are so many amazing routes that you're unlikely to get to all of them if you wait for perfect conditions, So why not go out and do the routes that are a few notches below your on-site level, and maybe even they can be, bad condition on-site challenges for you. That can still be really fun, but then you get to do a lot of really incredible routes that way.
Yeah, I like that. It can, the conditions can kind of force you to knock it down a couple notches, which if, somebody like me, where you're maybe a little bit more performance obsessed and you're trying to push your grade up and all that, if essentially your hand is forced to just do more fun routes that are a little bit lower of a grade, those are some of my most fun days out on rock, like is climbing some 510s and just trying to get like 8 routes in a day. So we'll talk specifically about some of our favorite routes by grade coming up here in just a second, but we'll try to get some of the housekeeping out of the way for those who are visiting. And I want to touch on just briefly where to stay when we come out to the Red. And for those who haven't been here, the towns around the Red aren't very developed. It's becoming more and more developed, but there's only a handful of restaurants. There's really only a handful of lodging options, depending on what your requirements are for comfort level. And so it does kind of still feel pretty rustic in Slade and the surrounding zones. We could click through maybe kind of rustic to more bougie, if we will here. Kris, you probably spent some rustic times out of the red. Maybe we'll start with you on that, and then we'll go over to Eric for the bougier side.
Yeah, I suspect my take is outdated at this point, but I've spent a lot of really amazing rustic nights in the red. There are a lot of just out of the way camping spots where we would just throw down a sleeping bag and sleep on the ground. And, you know, the forests are just incredible, especially if you roll in at night and you're waking up in the morning with the sun rays coming through the foliage, and, you know, it can just be incredible. And in more recent years, we would stay at some of the more developed campgrounds. The Land of the Arches was probably where we stayed the most through those last years I was there. And I don't know what the dispersed camping situation is like in the red now. So,
well, I can speak to that, and then Eric, we'll get your thoughts on some other options. But I've been camping out there a bit lately with the kids. And so just last week we camped out at Funk Rock City, not at the crag, but there's campsites along the trail on the way in that are along the creek. And it was absolutely gorgeous, and the birds are chirping. And then we woke up and we're able to leave everything in the tent and just hike our gear out to Funk Rock and have a really fun morning. And we got out there before anybody else because we were just minutes away from it. So yeah, there's some great camping just around. And then of course, camping at Land of the Arches, I think maybe a little bit more quiet and comfortable than the Miguel's scene. But if you're young or you just want to be a part of like the climbing vibe, camping in the backyard of Miguel's there, hitting the gear shop, getting some food in the morning, hanging out by the basketball courts and cooking food and talking beta or climbing partner, Miguel's is still the epicenter of Red River Gorge climbing.
Sure. And it always has been, and it's grown with the community. I think that's a really interesting thing about Miguel's is, you know, Eric, when you and I first went to the red, Miguel's was like enough room for 3 or 4 cars in the front and had 2 picnic tables.
It was an ice cream shop.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's grown with the size of the community. So the Venturas have done an incredible job of scaling that thing to what it needs to be.
This episode is supported by PhysiVantage Nutrition, and I've been using PhysiVantage since long before there was ever even a podcast. I've been a paying customer for many years now. It tastes the best, and it does the best for me and supporting my goals in my training, my recovery, and my performance. As a rock climber, I'm sure you all are familiar with their products. Their athlete team is crazy, from Alex Magos to Jonathan Segrist, Amity Worm to Daniel Woods, and so many other crushers out there are using PhysiVantage regularly. And that's because it works. I use their supercharged collagen every day before I train my fingers or I go climbing. I use their vegan PowerPlex protein, which tastes incredible. The chocolate flavored protein that PhysiVantage makes is just crazy. That's like my sweet treat that I have at the end of every day. I'll either mix it up with some water or milk, or I'll mix a scoop in with my plain Greek yogurt, and it tastes like chocolate pudding. It is so, so good. And then recently, because I've been trying to build up that endurance for my long, pumpy climbs out here at the Red, I've been using a lot of their Sendurex, which is like a beetroot extract. It's highly concentrated. It is science-backed to help support the endurance system. And I'm feeling like I'm climbing longer and harder and also recovering faster when I'm using PhysiVantage products. So I think you're going to love it too. If you haven't tried it, you can get 15% off your order over at PhysiVantage.com using code STRUGGLE15. If you're looking to level up your training, your recovery, and your performance, I have really felt the difference using this stuff for the past few years. And I think you will too. Check it all out at PhysiVantage.com and use code STRUGGLE15 to get that discount. I just want to take a quick second here to talk about how I'm keeping track of all my training and climbing over the course of days, weeks, months, and years. And I'm using an actual physical analog journal, a paper journal that I'm holding in my hands right now, called the 5-Year Training and Performance Journal. I created this. I've been using something like this for the last 9 years, and it's a reflective journal, meaning I put something in for every single day. And at the end of the year, the next year starts back underneath that first one. So that as you go, you are able to see where you were at 1 year prior, 2 years prior, 3 years prior. You can log your goals at the beginning of every month and see what you checked off. And then the big breakthrough for me is that I'm able to reflect back and see what training interventions are actually working, what are worthwhile, and maybe which ones aren't. And I'm also able to see with a ton of gratitude and joy how much progress I've made. And I've never been able to get that from training apps. I like training apps. They help me to do my training, but this reflective journal has totally changed how I'm able to understand my personal training, my performance, and then everything that I do as a climber, like all my notable routes that I've sent, all my thoughts and dreams, they're all in here. And I get to look back and enjoy that day after day and year after year. And now you can too, because I made it and I'm selling it. And for $40, I think that's probably the cheapest thing you could buy that will last you 5 years as a climber. You can learn more over at thestruggleclimbingshow.com/journal. Eric, you obviously have a cabin out here now. We can talk about that, as do I. My family has a cabin in the same Cliffview development as you do. But when you were coming out here initially with the family, what were you all doing?
Yeah, our first couple of trips, McGill's for sure. And again, it was maybe a half a dozen or a dozen tents at that time in the mid 90s. It wasn't a, huge expanse like a Woodstock type experience that it is now. But quickly, when we came down with our kids, it wasn't the right thing for us. Like we love eating at McGill's and hanging around there in the evening for a bit, but it's loud, it's boisterous. It is more, I've always kind of perceived it as a lot of college age to 20 somethings. That's kind of the main demographic. And so if you're rolling in with your kids or if you're an older couple, it might not be the best fit. There's other options. Land of Arches is a little quieter camping area with the same local access to the crags and everything. So it's the same kind of experience. And we stayed quite often at Little Abner's, which is a little hotel in Slade. It's not a 5-star or anything like that. It's $80 a night. It's a place to sleep with a roof over your head. And it worked for us when we had small kids. And so a lot of people use those hotels. There's a couple of other small hotels around. But what there is a lot of are rental properties now, Airbnb type and rental cabins. I think it's over 400, maybe pushing 500 now in that region. Wow. A 30-mile radius around the Red. There's hundreds of these rental properties. But if you're coming prime season in the autumn, they're all booked right now. Like the month of October, you'd probably have a tough time getting something booked, certainly a weekend at any of those rental properties. So you really need to plan ahead if you're doing a trip there in prime season. Now, if you're looking for a place in February or March, you could wait till 2 weeks before and lock something in for sure. So it really depends on, the timing of your trip. But there's plenty of options and there's more cabins being built, probably another 10 or 20 every season in that region. So as the number of climbers grows, the accommodations are slowly growing along with that. Like you said, now that my wife and I are empty nesters, a few years ago, we invested in building our own property just because I really had the vision that as an older climber, this is a place I want to spend a lot of time. Pretty much I perceive spending every autumn season that I'm alive, perhaps at the Red, because the climbing is that good. And it's a style that you can climb at a high level, not just by raw strength and power, which I don't have anymore, but by wisdom and technique and experience. And also, climbing fitness, endurance. And maybe we'll talk about this later, but that's something you can hang on to into old age a lot more than you can hang on to, your strength and power. And so as an older climber, I have more opportunities to climb hard at the Red, perhaps, than anywhere else in the United States.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. And to talk about that aspect, the kind of the fitness aspect and how we can continue to push ourselves. I will add one thing to the lodging discussion here, and that's the Bedrock Hostel, which is over kind of near Muir Valley and is a fairly new build. And I've spent some time over there. I filmed a video with Alex Megos, and they've got a private, it's not for people who stay there, at least at this point in time, but the owners have a private kilter board and moon board, like in a separate structure on the property. But in terms of cost to climber, community and fun vibes and location, it's a really good option and will be far less expensive than booking a cabin. Now, if you've got 10 friends, you could book a cabin and probably do great. But the Bedrock Hostel seems like a really good option, similar to what you noted, Eric, with like Little Abner's or some of the motels. But Bedrock is very much geared towards climbers. Right. So yeah,
and Sunny has a hostel in Stanton also. He calls it's called the Climber's Home, I think is what it's called,
Yep.
or something like that.
Yeah, Sonny's been featured in some really nice films as well about him and his relationship with the red and his climbing. And then I guess the last thing that I'll add to this, and we can move on because people are going to find a place to crash one way or the other. But I'm a commuter from Louisville, and it's 2 hours to get there, and I day trip it all the time. I'll drop my daughter off at school at about 8:15 a.m. and then scoop up my buddies, and we'll get out there, maybe start climbing around 11 or 11:30. And I mean, at least at this point in time in my fitness, I'm like wrecked after 3 routes, maybe 4 routes at the most, because they're pretty long and pumpy as discussed. And I'm often back by dinner time, or certainly in time to get the kids in a bath and to bed. So while not ideal if you want to climb, many, many days in a row, you could commute from Lexington's only about 45 minutes, and there's lots of lodging options there. And then as you get a little bit closer, there's Stanton and Clay City and Winchester. And Beattyville. Right. So plenty of like kind of shorter commute options if staying in the red just isn't in the budget or everything's booked up or whatever. And then Kris, did you have one more thing to add here as well?
Last quick thing I'll say is if you're planning on camping and you're coming from the Western US and you haven't spent time in the Southeast, plan for the humidity. It's going to wreak havoc on your camping setup. Your tent's going to mold if you're there for more than a couple weeks. Bring extra towels. Plan for the humidity.
Yeah, and pack a raincoat, Gore-Tex or something, because under those steep walls you can climb on a day that it's raining, but you still need to get from your car to the crag, to the cave, and so a raincoat comes in helpful. And also, I swear by my La Sportiva GTX approach shoes, because the GTX shoes have the Gore-Tex liner on it, and so if you don't have those at the red, especially in the spring season, you're going to have wet feet because there's a lot of muddy trails and, dampness everywhere. And so, Gore-Tex shoes, Gore-Tex jacket is a good investment, especially if you're a spring season or summer season climber there.
Good beta. One thing that I wanted to touch on, just again, wrapping up kind of the housekeeping, is where to eat. And We've mentioned Miguel's, of course, and there's a handful of other restaurants out there. I've got a list, and maybe I'll just kick it to you guys to talk about maybe where one of your favorite places. But I've jotted down Miguel's, Red Point Barbecue, Hops Fork, Rock House, La Cabana, and Skybridge Station. There are others out there. That's just kind of my short list of places that I like to fuel up after a day of climbing. Eric, we'll start with you here. What are your favorite one or two places you'd recommend for people to grab a dinner?
Yeah, that's pretty much the options. I mean, I'm always been a big pizza eater, so I like McGill's. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, a lot of people say it's not the most amazing pizza, but I'll tell you, after climbing all day, it tastes pretty amazing. And, just the environment there, people, chit-chatting in the evening. I think it's just fun to be there and have a few slices of pizza for dinner. But I enjoy Rock House. I enjoy La Cabana. My wife's a huge fan of Red Point. I'm not a big meat eater, which is primarily, it's a carnivore restaurant. There's not a lot of options, but it's a beautiful place to hang out for sure. And if you can't eat the meat, you can drink the booze at the Rock House.
They've got good cocktails.
Yeah, so I mean, I've been to all of those areas, and if you drive an hour, you have access to the bigger restaurant chains when you get closer to Lexington. But that's not really in play, except maybe on a rest day.
Yeah, lots of good options, and probably a handful of those that I just clicked off, Kris, are new since you've been to the area. But what would you like to add to the conversation in terms of favorite places to dine?
The only thing I would add is that you have to go to Miguel's at least once, even if it's jam-packed and that's not your kind of scene. It's such a cultural touchstone for the red. You have to experience it. But otherwise, all of your options, I think, are the ones.
I am a strong proponent of going a little crazy with your pizza toppings. One of the things that sets Miguel's apart is they've got wild topping options. And so I put sweet potatoes and tofu and black beans and avocado. I put all sorts of weird stuff on my pizza. So there's great options there, but I'll also give a shout out to Skybridge Station, which is a little bit closer over to like Muir and like the northern area. And I'm a vegetarian, so they have vegan sausages and all sorts of good stuff. So there's actually a lot of good options there. Hops Fork has some like pretty bougie food and great cocktails, and and Rock House has an incredible veggie burger and burrito. So now I'm getting hungry. Let's move on. Let's talk about training. And I'm fortunate to have two incredibly experienced coaches here who have a specific expertise in training climbers for the Red River Gorge. So this will be a rich area. We've talked about the pump, but there's other aspects of Red River Gorge climbing. Kris, we can start with you. You, in fact, have an entire power company course called Red River Pump Prep, which I've personally taken. And just in general, how do you think about preparation for if you're going to come to the Red for a weekend or a couple of weeks? What should climbers be focusing on, and how then should they do it?
Yeah, well, first let me say this before I forget to. If your listeners want to check out the Red River Pump Preps, they come in, I believe we have 511, 512, and 513 versions, and they can get it $25 off with the code Struggle Pump. So, jump on the website and check that out. But I think there are a couple of things that are unique about the Red that people have to consider if they've never climbed this long, pumpy style. And those are, we've talked a little about getting the pump, but you have to get comfortable mentally in the space where you're really pumped and you're not sure if you can continue. You have to learn how much further you can go while you're pumped. And you have to get comfortable spending a lot of time on the wall. There are, some of my hardest sends in the Red, I was on the wall for nearly an hour. So you can be up there for a long time. It's not your typical 7-minute sport route.
Yeah.
And the last thing I would say is that you have to understand that this is kind of a double-edged sword. Being geographically close doesn't mean you're close, but also because they're endurance routes, they can come together in a different way than the just execute a hard move type of route that most people are probably familiar with if you're from the Western United States. Successive goes, you're likely to get a little bit further, a little bit further, a little bit further, and don't give up on that. I think that's that ties into being on the wall for longer and just getting comfortable in that pump, but it's a tactic I think a lot of people don't consider unless they've climbed that style before.
Well, let's get granular for a second, and then Eric would love to get your perspective as well, as you've helped to prepare me for seasons out at the Red River Gorge. But Kris, when you mentioned the Red River Pump Prep, and thanks for giving listeners a discount. That's really cool. I have taken that, and it did prepare me very well for a season at the Red, and it was kind of a self-guided. It was like all loaded in the app, and I was able to do it at a gym that didn't even have ropes. Like I didn't have like an auto belay or a rope. I was doing it at a bouldering gym. And when you're talking about preparation for the Red, are we just talking about a ton of volume, or are there other ways that you look at preparing a climber for? How many weeks are we talking about prior to arriving?
Well, personally, I think, if you can have a longer training cycle, up to around 12 weeks or something, that's probably ideal. But if it's a trip and you're coming off of, summer season in Wyoming or something, or Colorado, you may not have that full 12 weeks, or early fall somewhere else. You might not have all that time. So I think you need about 6 weeks, 4 weeks minimum, I would say. And depending on the amount of time you have, you can work on other aspects of your climbing, and depending on, your level. But I think for the beginner climbers up to about 512, endurance is going to be the number one thing you need in the Red. The, local forearm, more aerobic endurance. If you can master that, if you can master the ability to rest and recover on the wall, and the ability to keep going through the pump, that's going to be your number one asset up to that level. Obviously, you're always going to want strength and power. They're always going to be helpful, as much of it as you can have. But up to that level for a Red River trip, I wouldn't sacrifice the endurance work for more hard boulders if possible.
Eric, you are absolutely a master of that endurance recovery on route. I can't even count how many times I've belayed you where a first go, you've kind of hung at every bolt and maybe ticked some things and talked about how hard it all looks and feels, and then just absolutely fired it the second go, seemingly wresting your way up the wall. It's something that I really find impressive and I admire when I see it. And it's something that I, in fleeting moments, am able to capture, but not with the regularity that you have. So what is the secret?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's one secret, because as simple as climbing at the red seems, like people say, oh, it's just a ladder, you just, right, Kris, you've heard that. It's just a crimp ladder.
Yeah.
But it's way more complex than that, and yeah, many routes don't have a definitive crux move. Like you go to most climbing areas, certainly a place like Wild Iris, you get on a route, there's usually a definitive in your face crux move. New River Gorge, same thing. Rumney, same thing. It's those areas, it's almost like you're bouldering on a rope sometimes, because it's, very specific, you need the power to do a hard move. The red is not like that, at least certainly not in the middle grades. I don't climb 514. I'm sure there are 514s that have really hard. I know there's routes that have really hard moves at the red, but they're not the 10s, 11s, 12s, and even in some cases the 13s. You can climb 513 and not do a move over V4. So as Kris alluded to, it is very aerobic in terms of your training. And so if you're someone who is enamored of kilter board training or bouldering as your main training modality, that's fine if you're training for Wild Iris or if you're training for bouldering. But if you're training for the red, it's going to be a failed approach. You'll be hanging on maybe the fourth bolt of every route. You know that feeling at the dark side, you feel really strong off the ground. And then at bolt 4 or 5, people are like, oh my God, my forearms are exploding like the Hindenburg. How am I going to climb another 5 bolts to the top? And the answer is you need to be a more aerobic powered climber. The longer a route is, the more the aerobic energy system dominates. And so you need an anaerobic system to still contribute on the harder moves. But if you're counting on it to carry you up a route, it's going to fail you every time. And so long story short is, we're talking time frame of years. Building yourself to be a more aerobic climber really helps. And that's what the local climbers that you see climb on the undertow wall effortlessly. It's not necessarily because they have the routes wired. It's because they have such a powerful aerobic energy system that they can climb AL8 or chainsaw and do laps on it and only be aerobic powered, get very, very little pump on it. And it's a wonderful feeling when you've developed that level of fitness, but it involves things that aren't trainable overnight. Things like building new capillaries, having more capillary density in your climbing muscles, having more mitochondria mass and efficiency. And those things come from the climber's equivalent of what a runner does. Now I'm not saying we do a lot of running for climbing training. We do a little, but I'm saying the way a runner, if you talk to an elite level runner, they do a lot of base mileage. That's their aerobic training. And then they do very specific amounts of targeted anaerobic training, which is usually done in the form of interval training. Well, that's pretty much the program I put you on, Ryan, the last few years at the Red in terms of climbing, not the running version of it, but the climbing version of it. And the climbing version of it is having 1 or 2 days a week where you're climbing for volume. That means a lot of sub-maximal climbing. It's not the most exciting, but it can be fun. And so you're logging a lot of mileage, upwards of an hour or more of total climbing time, 1 or 2 days a week. That's your base mileage. And then putting in 1 or 2 days of interval training. And depending where you're at, there are different interval protocols that I've developed. But what I've put you on, and I've put many pro climbers, even 515 climbers that I've worked with on, is the 30-30 interval, which is a very taxing interval, but the beauty of it is it actually trains recovery, which is what you need on route at the Red. You're on a hard route, you need to be able to recover on the route, where you go anaerobic, aerobic, anaerobic, aerobic. And it's during those aerobic spells that you're actually able to recharge your anaerobic system. And I won't get into the bioenergetics of it, but that's a skill of its own, is being able to recover on the route. And sometimes it's easy. If there's a ledge, you can sit down for, like some of the Madness Cave routes, there's actually a sit down at mid height. But more commonly, there might be a good jog, or there might be a knee bar or something like that, where you can get the weight off your arms. It's not a total rest, but you can go through that recovery process. And then on the harder routes, sometimes you just have to have the technique and the ability to recover on small holds. And that's what the higher end climbs require. And that's what those 30-30 intervals train is that recovery ability. And then, you can't just ignore max strength and power training, but it's not the most important thing as a Red River Gorge climber. I would still say you do 1 day a week of that for maintenance, at least during training season. Maybe on performance season, you're not doing much of that anymore. Everything has to be nuanced and personalized, but that's kind of the basic framework. Again, if you're training for an area, a climbing area where it's more bouldery, then you would spend a lot more time doing the kilter boarding and the bouldering. But for the Red River Gorge, that's kind of a misplaced emphasis because most routes you're not limited by that. You're limited by your aerobic power, what you can generate through the aerobic energy system. And again, that's you develop that over the course of months and years, not days and weeks.
Yeah.
And so it's not something you can cram at the last minute. But if you're a local or if you're someone who climbs at the Red annually, like I know a lot of Western climbers who travel to the Red in the fall and they spend a month there. So, that's something they're looking forward to year round. And if they're smart, they're actually training a bit year round with that in mind. Because if you just abandon aerobic training completely for 6 or 8 months, you lose capillarity, you lose mitochondria mass, you lose them actually in just a few months. And so if you really want to be a good route climber year in and year out at the Red or an area like the Red, you need to make a constant investment in that base training. As boring as it might be, you need to be like that runner who is out doing his base mileage year round. Christmas morning, he's out doing his 10K training run. And not that climbers need to be quite that extreme, but I'm just trying to get across the idea that like someone like you, Ryan, the Red's your home area, you need to have a year-round commitment to maintaining that aerobic base. Because if you take an off season and don't do it for 3 to 6 months, you lose everything you gained prior to that, or much of it. And yes, it comes back a little faster the second time, but it's tough to get ahead. And, you examine the elite climbers, route climbers, Jakob Schubert, Alex Megos, they climb a lot of mileage pretty much year round. Yeah, they do training blocks where they're bouldering hard, but they're actually, the most important thing is they need to maintain their aerobic energy system. And, that's the stuff of Red River Gorge climbing. And I'm sure Kris's program that he works with people on, I'm sure addresses that quite well.
Yeah, it's pretty high volume, especially at the lower levels. A little lower volume as you get into the harder grades, I think. Eric, I'm curious. I'd love to hear your opinion on these thoughts. Number one, I think there's this idea, and you just alluded to it, it's a true idea that you can spin up your endurance a little faster than something like strength or power. But I think people hear that and they think, I don't need to work on endurance. And I think one of the big benefits of working on endurance a lot, especially in your early years and getting a lot of that mileage in, is the mental aspect and understanding, like I was talking about earlier, that pain cave you have to go in, to really believe that you can continue climbing when your forearms are totally bricked. So I think especially at the lower levels, even if endurance can physically be spun up a little faster, it's important, if nothing else, for your own mentality to keep it going.
Yeah, so those are good points. And let me just add to them a little bit here. When it comes to aerobic adaptations, there's really 2 types of adaptations. There's these, what I call soft adaptations, which relate to enzymes, the aerobic enzymes, lactate transporters, your buffering that you have in your body that buffers hydrogen ions that are kicked out by the glycolytic system. Those short-term soft adaptations actually come about very quickly. In 1 to 4 weeks, you can have gains in those. That's why if you do that little short training block before you go to the Red, you can spin those short-term adaptations up.
Right.
Someone that travels to the Red for a month will actually get those adaptations during their trip. The first week, they'll say, oh my God, I was getting pumped on everything. And by the third week, they're saying, I'm not getting as pumped anymore. That's because of those soft adaptations. Again, they're very quick adaptations. Now, to really become a master of endurance climbing, that's not enough. You need to have the structural adaptations. That's the capillaries. That's the mitochondria mass. And those don't happen in 1 to 4 weeks. They take months and years to play out. And that's where you need the long-term investment. So again, you can spin up short-term kind of as a stopgap, but if your goal is to really become a master of that style of climbing, then there's no getting around the need to get those structural adaptations by way of some of that higher volume training done pretty much year round at minimum 1 day a week, ideally 2 days a week. Again, it's like a runner putting in their base mileage. And final comment, running is actually somewhat helpful for this style of climbing, because what is central, what is ultimately what drives all recovery is your ability to circulate blood through your working muscles. So the muscles that are pumping out, your forearm muscles, you need to force fresh blood, oxygenated blood into them and get the stale blood out with all the metabolic byproducts. And what does that? It's called your heart. And so the heart strength is measured by what's called stroke volume. Every stroke of your heart, how much blood does it push through your system? Well, a runner has a very high stroke volume. A non-runner or non-aerobic athlete does not. If you tested the stroke volume of someone who just boulders, it would be quite low compared to, say, an Alex Megos, who's a route climber, or compared to a runner. And so a very beneficial adaptation of doing at least a little running, say 3 days a week, is you will develop a stronger heart that pushes more blood through your body, through your forearms, and that is critical for recovering between routes and on routes. And that's why running is actually a valid aspect of training for route climbing. Not so much for bouldering, but for training for route climbing, absolutely. And you know what? You talk to the world's best route climbers, many of them are runners. So again, it comes down to how much time you have to invest in training. But if I was putting together the perfect training program for the Red River Gorge, it would include some running. Again, as a long-term investment, it's not going to get you up your route tomorrow or next week. But in terms of building that complete picture, that stronger heart, becoming stronger every season means you will recover a little faster every season. So again, as simple as climbing at the Red seems to be on the surface, it's actually quite complex to train optimally for. And one final comment, and then I'll stop talking here. Kris is absolutely right. One of the traits that is essential for climbing at your limit or pushing your limits at the Red is being able to climb through the pump, which is one part physical, but it's a big part mental. It's really becoming comfortable with discomfort. It friggin' hurts when you're up there on the force, Ryan, and your forearms are exploding and you got 2 bolts to the anchors. It hurts. And your brain generates what I call stopping thoughts. Just like when you're running hard, your brain says, hey, stupid, stop, walk a little bit. Well, the climbing equivalent of that is hanging on the bolt. Well, to send your route, you have to ignore those stopping thoughts or overcome those stopping thoughts. And really, I think the only way you develop that is through experience. Someone like Kris, who climbed at the Red for 20 years, you slowly become conditioned to overcoming those stopping thoughts, climbing through the pain of the exploding forearms, and persevering. And whereas the person going to the Red the first time, they sense those exploding forearms and they just take right away. And so that's the difference between a newbie at the Red and a veteran at the Red. And yes, there are physical things that limit you. You just can't will yourself to the chains, but it's part of it. It's part of the formula.
Totally.
There is, if you're looking at like a linear spectrum, like it's like a bar graph, there's like a little section between where your brain says stop into where you physically actually must stop. And that little section might be 2 moves to a lay down rest or a couple moves to the chains. And one thing that I'll just add to that, because I can't speak with expertise like you all have, but I can speak to some experience, is that as a very busy climber, I don't often have the time to be able to do everything I'd like to do to prepare, especially on the aerobic side. And, the big difference makers for me on the force, for example, were doing Red River pump prep, a lot of the things that Kris lays out in that course, and what Eric prescribed to me, like 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off for an hour on the tread wall at a pretty moderate kind of pump level, and then doing those 30-30s the last couple of weeks before I wanted to peak. That was the meat and potatoes of my preparation. But one thing that I was able to use that may or may not work for the listener, but that really helped me, especially on the mental side, was blood flow restriction. And there's physiological adaptations that happen on that as well. And you're essentially training your system to process the waste products a little bit more efficiently because BFR cuffs essentially occlude the venous return. And so you have to be a little bit more efficient with how you kind of go through the waste products of the muscle. But for me, maybe even more so, the benefit of that is that it instantly puts on that exploding pump feeling, like within 30 seconds of having the cuffs on and doing a couple feet on the ground campus ladders. And in 15 minutes, the entire workout for me would be about 15 minutes of doing this. I was shocked to see how many more moves I could make after my brain said stop. And it's in a very safe, controlled environment because it's feet on the ground and I have a boulder pad behind me. And so as soon as I come off, I just kind of land on my butt and then rest. But there is this difference between when your mind says stop and when your body actually forces the stop. And that is incredibly handy at the Red River Gorge. And so, Kris, kind of dovetailing now into these first few days of somebody's time at the Red, as Eric mentioned, if you're here for a longer trip, sometimes that first week just feels awful, but then you're able to wind up that system and you maybe have developed some quicker endurance adaptations coming from there. But if somebody's coming in for a week only, for example, and they've done Red River Pump Prep and they're bringing in some fitness, there's still nothing like getting on a 15 bolt route at 30 degrees overhung. And so let's talk a little bit about the tactics of how a trip could break down and really setting someone up for success. And success can be defined in any number of ways, but let's define it as having a really good time, enjoying your time at the Red, and then maybe ultimately doing some routes at a projecting grade that you've identified. Maybe you've got some objectives coming in, but if you've got a week or maybe it's 2 weeks, however you would want to break it up, what are those first kind of handful of days looking like? And just tactically speaking, what should the listener be thinking about to make the most out of their time here?
Yeah, I would say your first handful of days, you're going to want to drop your level down a bit. If you want to go up and put your feelers on something hard that you want to try eventually, sure. But spend most of your time trying to send things that are a number grade below your project level or something and get yourself a little pumped. Get used to using the friction to your advantage. If you're a limestone climber, granite climber, the Red's going to have a lot more friction than you're used to. And you can let that do a little of the work. And that's going to make the grade seem more attainable if you can let the friction do some of it. And I would say lean into I'm uncomfortable. This is where normally I would say, I can't continue executing these moves. When you start to feel that, try to keep going. See how many more moves you can do. If you've learned to let the friction do some of the work, you can do way more moves than you think you can. And you're going to start to spin up those soft adaptations that Eric was talking about if you're putting yourself into those sorts of situations. And take care of your skin. There's more friction, so your skin's going to get a little beat up. I'm a rhino skin fan, so I love repair and performance. Those things are worth their weight in gold when you're essentially just sanding your skin down all day long. So the first few days, get yourself pumped, climb a bunch of routes, plan a rest day before you start trying anything actually really difficult for you in terms of grade. And don't be discouraged when a thing that's a grade you normally climb regularly feels hard. I remember a trip, a bunch of the Wyoming guys came out to the Red and they were at the Mother Lode, and my friend Tom went up convicted, a 13A at the Mother Lode, and he said, there's not even a hard move on this thing, And I said, well, you going to do it next go? And he's like, no, I can't put all that together. Not a chance. So something that doesn't feel that hard to you might take a long time to do if you don't have all these skills. So spend those first days getting pumped, I think.
This episode's brought to you by Rungni. Y'all know Rungni. It's Magnus Mitbo's company. I love every single thing they make. Let me highlight a few of my favorite products right now. First of all, the harness pants. Oh my gosh, you probably heard me talk about these pants like for the past year. They are durable, they are stretchy, they are feather light, and they look fantastic. And now, oh man, I'm really psyched. They just launched a new version of the harness pants. It's like an offshoot. It's the harness utility pants. More pockets, elastic waistband for the perfect fit, and also improved sizing. So whether you're rubbing up against rock or trekking through the forest, these pants are tough, they're durable, and they are built to withstand whatever you throw at them. And I also want to highlight Magdust Super Dry. This is a new chalk that they just came out with. Super dry formula. If you've got sweaty hands, or if you're like me, you're spending a lot of time in the gym right now, this stuff will keep your hands sticky on rock or plastic. I love all of it. You can use code STRUGGLE and get 10% off pretty much everything over at Rungni. Let's go. This episode is supported by patrons of the show. If you're a Patreon member, you're not hearing this because you get ad-free episodes. But if you are hearing this, I would love for you to consider becoming a Patreon member. I've got over 100 hours of bonus content over on Patreon. That includes extended interviews, bonus episodes, as well as pro clinics with the absolute biggest names in the sport. I'm hustling really hard over here in the podcast/utility closet, and I'm really proud of how big this struggle community has grown. Whatever your budget is, and even if you can only pop in for a few months, you could come check it out and for a few bucks, get yourself access to all of that amazing content. So if you're serious about training and climbing, if you're serious about these athletes, I think you are because you're listening to this right now, I'd love to invite you over to Patreon to check it out. There's that link right there down in your show notes, or you can learn more over at patreon.com/The Struggle Climbing Show. Thank you so much for your support. I'd love to hear from you. Hit me up. Let me know how I can continue to deliver great stuff for you. And now let's get back to this fantastic conversation. Eric, how about for you as you come in for the season and you haven't been climbing in a while, and certainly for any clients or just friends that you're helping to coach, tactically speaking, how can we make the best of our goes here at the Red?
If you're a first-time visitor or somebody that's not used to the steep climbing, it can be very intimidating. It was, when I went there the first few times, it was like the mother lode just, actually for years, very much intimidated me. And it just takes exposure over and over to kind of rewire your brain. Because I was a trad climber for the first 10 years of my life. And then I climbed and bolted routes at the New River Gorge for the next 15 years of my life. And so I mainly stood on my feet and climbed vertical routes that had hard moves, but they weren't these just, intimidating, steep cave lines. And so that takes time to wrap your head around and become comfortable with. And so if your first few visits are there, you need to ease into it. Like, just don't go straight to Madness Cave. Maybe start off at Undertow Wall, and also becoming comfortable falling. Like you said, Ryan, it's quite different taking little whippers on a slab. It has a different feel. It feels more secure than these steep routes where you just have nothing but air below you, and you take a fall, and your belayer tends to be generous with the rope, and the bolt might be just below your feet when you fall, but somehow you go 20 or 30 feet with stretch and play in the system. But it's all safe. You just need to, again, wrap your head and acclimate to this new normal, you might say. And so for people making their first ventures, that is a big thing you're going to need to likely work through. Now, if you're, a veteran or someone who's, kind of past that hurdle, then there's other things at play. I mean, you get on routes with smaller holds. Kris mentioned skin wear is a big issue. If you're at the Red for a month, the elite climbers, people way better than me that I climb with at the Red are constantly fighting skin battles with their fingers, kind of like boulderers do. It's a little less common on route climbing, limestone routes for sure. But at the Red, you can pulverize your tips and get cracks here in your DIP joint from crimping. And so skin care and, like Kris said, having your protocols down and just having experience on how to deal with those things, or climbing with tape on, are all parts of the game. If you're coming in and climbing, routes with bigger holds and that are less difficult, the skin wear is not as big of a deal. But for the higher end climbing, it sure is. And, we talked about it being a very much endurance oriented area, and, you need to fuel properly. My old days, I would go climbing all day with just a bottle of water. It was so stupid, but that's how people did it back in the 80s. we didn't have energy bars and, we could have brought fruit, but we weren't that smart.
Right.
But now, of course, climbers tend to be more savvy, is that you need to fuel throughout the day. And then when you're done climbing, start fueling and recovering as soon as you can, especially if you're going to climb 2 days in a row. You want to get that process started. And so, nutrition's a big part of the game, and maybe down in 3 beers in the evening isn't the best thing if you want to climb the next day. In fact, I'll tell you, it definitively is not the best thing. But if you're going home to your family, like Ryan, then have a beer at the end of the day, I guess.
Yeah.
Not that your family
definitely
requires the beer, but but so again, there's a lot of details you could get into, and it's kind of what is appropriate for you. If you're just getting started in climbing, then a lot of this stuff is TMI. But if you're someone who's more of a veteran climber, really trying to get that 1% gain to send your project, then the little things really do matter.
Well, I appreciate that. It's great perspectives all around there. And I do enjoy the send beer as well as the not send beer, but I try not to have more than the one. I will shout out as well, because you brought up nutrition and recovery, for the pump, PhysiVantage, which of course is your company, Eric, so I'm going to give you a shout out here. I try not to embarrass
Thanks.
you, but you make a product called Sendurex, which is like a beetroot citrulline malate. Obviously, I've talked about it on this show for helping that aerobic system. Sendurex is proven, it's science backed and can really help on that side of thing. And then I always bring an insulated shaker bottle of protein that you all make. There's lots of different proteins out there. I think PhysiVantage makes a great one and a great tasting one. And so I put some ice in that, and it's an insulated bottle, and I shake it up and I just leave it in the car. And then at the end of the day, the first thing that I drink is that. Before I get to Miguel's, before I do anything else, I'm getting that protein in me. So just a couple little tips there for those who are going to come out and have some long days at the Red. Definitely make sure you're fueling.
Another option is to take a good protein bar to the crags and save it for the end of the day, so that, like, when you take your harness off and put it in your pack, you pull that protein bar out and you eat that on the way to your car. So you're immediately getting 20 grams of protein, and along with that, some carbs in the bar as well. And that kind of gets something into your bloodstream immediately, because it might take an hour or two until you make a meal or you go to a restaurant somewhere. And I appreciate the kind words about the Sendurex. It really does work. And let me just give the listeners just one little analogy to tell you why it works so well. Is the active ingredients, the beetroot extract and citrulline malate, which work together to vasodilate your capillary system. Your capillaries are very teeny tiny. Think of them as like the size of your hair, but actually even smaller, and they innervate your muscles. Well, when you take the Sendurex, those capillaries, which normally are basically one-lane highways, the red blood cells have to line up one after another, like cars in a construction zone where there's one lane. When you vasodilate the capillary, you turn it into a 2-lane. So now all of a sudden the traffic is flowing more smoothly. And a little while ago, we talked about the importance of blood flow to your muscles to drive the recovery process. Well, part of that is the heart pushing more blood, but it also, you need to reduce the resistance, the friction of the system. And that's where, if you open up the capillaries and vasodilate them, you get more blood flow. And by the way, that does happen. That vasodilation happens as part of a good warm-up process, which is very important at the Red. Warming up does trigger your body to start to open up those capillaries and get more circulation to your peripheral muscles. But you can expedite and enhance the process with the Sendurex. And that's why it's such an effective supplement taken pre-workout or pre-climbing for any aerobic activity. We even had Olympic swimmers using it, in addition to Olympic climbers using it in the last Olympics, because it's a very valid and effective nutritional intervention to help you kind of peak your system out.
Thank you for the additional scientific context. Well, I'll just take a second to hook the listeners up and recap, because we want to help you guys perform here at the Red. So Struggle Pump is the code that you'll use over at Power Company if you want to get $25 off the Red River Pump Prep. Struggle 15 will get you 15% off any full-priced product over at PhysiVantage, so Sendurex, and also everything else, which is I use all of it. It's great. And also, Kris, you shouted out Rhino, and I'm a big fan of Rhino as well. And code Struggle will get you 20% off everything over at Rhino. So I use the Perform, but I also use, because my skin's a little bit wetter, I use like the dry spray or the tip juice to kind of just toughen my skin up and dry it off a little bit as I'm getting into the season. So Lots of good options there. I'll put all that stuff down in the show notes for you guys. We don't have to belabor it. One thing I'm going to say on tactically that really worked for me is the power of the low point. And Kris and Eric, you both coached me on using the low point tactic on the force, and I ignored it to my detriment for almost a full season. I thought I was very, very close. And this harkens back to, Kris, what you said early on, which is you may feel geographically close to the chains, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually close to the chains.
Yeah.
And on the force, I kept falling just a few moves from the chains for a season. And I kept just starting from the ground because I just felt so close and I was through all the business. And it wasn't until I started just truly embracing the low point and not thinking about sending, going out for full days saying, I'm going to start 5 bolts up and go to the chains. That's a send for me. And then maybe the next day going up and saying, I'm going to start 4 bolts up just after the crux, the low crux, and get to the chains. And that's going to be a send for me. And sometimes I do it and sometimes I wouldn't, but I was reprogramming. This is a very specific example here, but for me, I kept falling at the chains. I got to the point where mentally I was like, okay, here's where I fall as I was going into that last sequence.
Yep.
And I rewrote that script in my mind after doing a few days of low pointing and actually getting through that last move and getting to the chains. And they weren't the hardest moves on the route by a mile, but they were just hard because I was so flamed when I got to the top. And doing that low point really helped. And that's, I think, while that applied very well for me on the force, I think that can apply for a lot of Red River Gorge climbing if people are coming out and they want a project.
Yeah, I'll just add to that really quickly that the low point is so valuable for a lot of reasons. But number one, what you mentioned, it sort of reprograms you to be able to climb through that spot where you've been falling. But also, it can really help teach you how to protect the send up high. Maybe this is mostly a Red River phenomenon or other pumpy areas phenomenon. But once you're through a section near the top, you're pumped, the old you might still have a chance of falling. If you've learned to protect the send and you know what's coming and you can climb through there pumped, it becomes a lot easier to do so. So I think that's a really helpful piece of it. It might also highlight some things for you up high that you weren't aware of because you always fall there, then pull back on after hanging on the rope. It might highlight that your beta, it needs a slight change, or it might highlight a rest for you, just a quick shake you didn't even know existed because you had never climbed into that position from the ground really pumped. So there are a lot of things that I think the low point does really well. And, why not spend a go or two doing the low point where you take the send out of the equation entirely instead of spending a whole season falling off at the same moves up high. So it seems like a waste at first, but I think when you start to use it, it becomes a really valuable tactic.
Absolutely. Eric, anything to add there on the low point? I know you're a fan of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, you guys both covered it quite well. It's a valid technique, and especially I think in situations where you are falling repeatedly at the end, like you were on the force, I think it's quite applicable. I personally, like when I'm rehearsing a route, I go out of my way to practice, the last 2 bolts.
Yeah.
Multiple times, more than I do the rest of the climb, with kind of the mindset that if I get there, I don't want to fall. Kris said, protect the send. I've not heard that. That's a great way to put it, because that's kind of what I'm thinking in my head as I'm thinking, God, Eric, you're so old. Like, you have this chance to put this route away now. Why waste another day on it? And that's the self-talk that I'm going through in my head, is that, like, if I made it to that point, I can't be an idiot and blow it. And so knowing that, when I'm rehearsing things, like, I love second going routes, as you know, Ryan. And so, like, when I'm going up a route, I might just roughly figure out the beta on the bulk of the route. But then the last 2 bolts, I really figure it out, because if I somehow fight through on a second go, everything up to that point, I don't want to blow it. So yeah, I think totally, it's an important thing for people to spend more time on. And, unfortunately, if you're always starting from the ground, the part of the climb you have the most practice on is the first 2 bolts, where you're fresh and really don't need necessarily the extra practice. Sure, every rep makes you more efficient, but you need to get those reps on the top as well. And so low pointing does that.
Just for the listener, because we just started talking about vernacular that maybe some of you are hearing for the first time. The low point is essentially starting fresh from higher up than the ground. Essentially, the idea is to go to the chains every time. And so maybe you start halfway up the route or even further up the route and then successfully kind of move your way closer to the ground so that you get to the point where now you're standing on the ground and you do the route. So you've rehearsed the top of the route more times. That's very different, by the way, listener, than climbing until you fall, hanging at that bolt and getting quote unquote fresh again, and then climbing to the top. That's a very different thing. That's climbing till you fall and then resting and climbing to the top.
High point.
That's what I did on the Force forever. And it wasn't until I truly started low pointing, saying, hey, ascend for me is from bolt 5 to the top, that I recognized that I needed to change beta at the top, to Kris's point, because I would climb, fall, rest, and then was fresh enough to pull moves that weren't as efficient as they needed to be. And so it wasn't until I started truly low pointing that I recognized I needed to not only change my beta, but then I just taught myself that I could climb through that pump. So, okay, we could do a whole episode on tactics. And in fact, we have. Kris and I have done a pro clinic on flash and on-site tactics. And Eric and I have actually had many episodes talking about, as he coached me on my road to 13A, tactics for climbing at the Red, as well as specifically on the Force. So I will link those episodes, but I want us to talk about routes now. And we'll try to be efficient with this as we go through. I want to try to talk about a few favorite routes, essentially at every number grade, starting at 5.9 or under. I've got some over here as well, but I'm going to defer mostly to you guys who have far more experience than I do. But I'll try to toss in a couple of my favorites in this as well. And if there's one that we want to highlight and why we like it so much, that's cool. But otherwise, we can just essentially creating a bit of a list here for the listener who maybe hasn't been able to do a lot of research or hasn't been to the Red. And maybe even if we've got some lesser known routes, some hidden gems out there, we can toss those in for those who are Red River Gorge veterans and are just looking for new things to hop on. So the first category I've got listed here is 5.9 and under. I don't know how easy, I don't know the last time you guys got on 5.9s or under. I've probably been on more of those because I've got a 7-year-old daughter. So maybe I can speak to this category a little bit better. But Kris, let's start with you. Favorite routes 5.9 and under?
Well, I certainly will not include sport routes on my 5.9 and under. Favorite routes. I don't even know what the 5.9 and under sport routes are in the Red, to be perfectly honest. But if you happen to take gear, I think Autumn is an incredible 5.9 trad route, short single pitch. Into the Purple Valley is also incredible at around 5.8.
What's Rock
and
Wars
I think
go?
Rock Wars, I think, is 10A, maybe 5.9 plus, something like that, but definitely an incredible one. And I would say my favorite under 5.9 pitch, or my favorite 5.9 and under route, is a multi-pitch route called Cavers that's on Tower Rock. I think it's 5.3. Just absolutely incredible adventure fun. So that's where I would land.
Yeah, great ideas. And
if you haven't taken your kids up Cavers route, you should do it.
Yeah, I haven't yet, and it's been on the list, so I appreciate the reminder. And that's
incredible.
Maybe, is that the first route ever at the Red River Gorge?
It's certainly one of the first. I'm not entirely positive. You'd have to ask James Maples. He would be the one who knows.
Yeah, I've got his book, of which you're on the cover, and so
I am the cover
have to
boy.
reference
Yeah.
that. Yeah, that's right. Eric, how about for you? We're taking the Wayback Machine here, 5.9 and under.
Yeah, I have done a slew of routes under 5.10, but I don't remember most of them. It's an old age thing. It's not a quality thing. I think the one that jumps out, I don't think Kris mentioned it, is 27 years of climbing at the gallery.
Great one.
Which is a classic 5.8. I don't really have any other ones off the top of my head. I mean, like you go to a crag like Bruise Brothers and there's a slew of, moderates there that are quite good. And at Muir Valley, I mean, throughout the gorge, there are these routes. That being said, you go to an area like the Motherlode Horseshoe, and there's not much there in terms of under even 11B. I mean, there are a few routes, but there's not a lot of quality. It's the crag that you kind of go to climb 12A on up.
Right. Well, we'll get there in a second. I'll click off a few of my favorites because, again, I've been out with the kids a little bit more often. There's a 5.6 classic at Global Village called Eureka.
Oh, yeah.
And
great route.
It's so great, and the hike back there is beautiful and cool. The only issue is that it's a very popular route, and there's not a whole lot of other things back there in that zone, so you might wait in line for a while. But that's classic. And by the way, every time I get on that, I have a blast. I make it an eliminate, and it's just like great fun plate climbing forever. A lot of the easier routes, quote unquote, like, you know, kind of the lower grade routes are very short, but this one is long and kind of consistent and really fun. And by the way, climbs harder than 5-6 in my opinion.
Retro bolted trad route. Used to be a trad route.
Oh, cool. Yeah, there are some great
Better
trad
as a
routes out
bolted
there
route.
as well. So to add to that, Eric mentioned Bruise Brothers. I won't go through the specifics, but that's a great crag for kind of easier to moderate climbing. There's a route at Fantasia called Creature Feature, which goes, I think, 5-9. And while it has like a little bit of a bouldery roof to start, after that, it's like 5-7 plate climbing forever and is so fun. So highly recommend. And if you're over there to climb Twinkie or something else, still get on Creature Feature because it's just that much fun. And then real easy climbing where you can just walk around and hang a top rope at Muir. There's a little mini crag called Recess Rock. And so that's if you've got the littles, there's some 5-4s and 5-5s that I take my kids up, and you can just hang a top rope, and they're very short. So if you're with somebody who's maybe afraid of heights or they want to really ease in, that's a good slab to climb. Okay, we'll move on to 5-10 now. And again, this is just any letter grade within the 5-10 range. Kris?
I mean, certainly you can't go wrong at breakfast burrito, I think is, you know, maybe like the 5-10 classic. But also, I think
it's maybe the best route in all of the Red River Gorge.
It's really incredible.
Have so much fun on that route.
Yeah, it's got a lot of what you look for in climbing. It's got really fun climbing, and then it's got a little bit of a heady section at the top, which is a lot of fun. You get some air under you, and just a really great route. And then I think the Oompa and Loompa, I'm not sure what their grades are, but I think they're in the 5-10 range. I think are really classic Red River style. You're going to probably get pumped on them. Even if you're a 5-12 climber, you're likely to get pumped on a 10, which you've maybe never experienced.
Yep.
And I have to shout out an early 5-10 bolted route in the red to defy the laws of tradition at left flank is just great.
Oh, great. All of those are so great. And I will say this about Oompa and Loompa. Those, for me, every time I get on them, I'm like, these have to be mid-11. They're just I just find them so hard, but they're incredibly high quality. Yeah. And I love to defy the laws at left flank is another great one.
Well, I'll also say if you're doing Creature Feature, just to the left of Creature Feature is Creep Show, which is one of the best early 5-10s in the red for sure.
Yeah, another really hard one, at least for me and my experience on it. I was like, I got smacked by that one. But yeah, great movement. And Breakfast Burrito was the top of my list on that one. So you covered all the bases for me. Eric, anything to add to those?
Another one that's fantastic is Brief History of the Climb at the gallery. Mm-hmm. Just a few routes to the right of the 27 years route that I mentioned earlier. And it's an amazing plated route. At least the upper part is plated and puppy and, just a wonderful route. Always has a line on it. That whole crag there.
So good. That's one that I get my kids on when we're over that way. And it's so featured that they can climb it and, they'll rest or hang on the top rope, midway up or whatever. It's not like super easy for them, but it's so featured. It's a great climb. Okay. Love those ideas. Now we're starting to get into a little bit more of the meat and potatoes into the 511s. And it's hard. I'm sure it's going to be hard to narrow these down. But there's three of us, so we should cover the bases here. Kris, some of the classics and maybe some things that aren't on the radar.
Boy, I would contend that the Red River Gorge has the best collection of 11B routes anywhere in the country. So this is a really tough one. My favorite route in the red is an 11A trad climb called the Inhibitor. My favorite route on the planet, I would say, is the Inhibitor. But that's not what we're here to talk about.
Is that at Roadside?
It's at Skybridge.
Oh, okay.
I do think there's an incredible 511 sport route that'll get you pumped. It's got a little bit of technical with King Me is near the Inhibitor.
King Me's incredible, yeah.
King Me's incredible. And I would throw in one around the corner from there at 11D, Dave the Dude, which is a little anti-Red River style. It's a little more technical, but incredible rock, really great climbing, really fun. So,
is that a sport route?
It's a sport route. Yep. There are 50 more 511s I could put at the top. So I'll let you guys take it from there.
Yeah, great ones. I haven't been on Dave the Dude. I'll add that to the list.
Oh,
Eric,
yeah,
how about
great
you?
one.
Favorite 511s?
Yeah, Kris said there's a slew. At Mirror Valley, Air Ride Equipped always has a line. It's
Yep.
short, steep, juggy, fun. King Me, he had mentioned already. Witness the Citrus is one I wrote down. It's 11D.
Classic pump.
It's incredible. And I'll tell you, you could probably make a case that it's like this close to 12A. It's maybe just missing one hard move to keep it from being that, but it's committing in a couple of spots, going through the one roof, pumpy clip. It's long. It's a full 100 feet or darn near 100 feet. And it doesn't let up until the very end. So, I mean, that is, I think, a classic. That's a Dario Ventura route, right, Kris?
Yep, I believe so.
Yeah. And I guess I want to throw in there, unfortunately, the zoo is closed, hopefully not permanently, but, who knows. But a Monkey in the Middle, I love that route. I've probably climbed it 20 times. If I go there, it's my warm-up route for the harder routes. Unfortunately, the zoo is at this time closed.
Yeah, there would be a few on my list from the zoo. Lynx Jinx is an 11C that's left of a Monkey in the Middle by a few routes that I really loved. And of course, as you get into the 12s, you've got Scar Tissue. But yeah, unfortunately, the zoo, at least at this point, off limits, but many, many other areas definitely on limits. The ones I will add to your fantastic list would be Whip Stocking at Drive-By is a fantastic
Incredible.
11A. And Crown of Thorns is an 11C that's really beautiful. And Snozberries, which I would say pushes 12A as hard as that thing was for me, but I think it currently gets an 11D, and that's at Chocolate Factory, and that's like maybe a harder version of Breakfast Burrito. You kind of climb some hard to moderate climbing into a cave, and then you have to pull this like hero move out of the cave where your feet cut and you swing out, and it's scary because you're above the bolt. And again, probably could add another 20 11As to it, but that would complete my list.
Yeah, it's a grade where you can go to almost any crag and there'll be an 11B or whatever that might not be a destination route, but you get on it and you're like, that's friggin' awesome. In fact, I think I just saw you post a photo of one of those routes on the left side of Purgatory. There's an 11B there that most people walk by it, but what's it called?
It's called Believer, and it's incredible.
Yeah, it's so good. Yeah, it's amazing.
Really
it's
good.
like a gym route, basically.
I'll also just throw in here, if you're looking for some out of the way great 511s, if you happen to find yourself at Funk Rock City, I think the Infidel is one of the best 11Ds in the red, and Prime Directive is one of the best like technical 511s.
That thing is committing. That's like it reminds me of a New River Gorge route.
Absolutely.
Directive. Yep. Kind of scary up there.
I hate to take us on a tangent. Well, I'll bring us back on course in just a second here. But I got on that. Remember, as I said, I camped at Funk Rock just recently with the kids.
Yeah.
And we got on Prime Directive, and I'm not kidding when I say I could not do it. I've never encountered. I think they call it 11B. I've never encountered an 11B where I couldn't do the moves, right? Like just hanging off the bolt. And it's super fun climbing up this like face to an arete to an overhang. And then you're supposed to pull onto this blank face or a couple bolts of like true slab climbing. And it was August, and it was not conditions for those holds, but I literally could not like even see how one would do it.
There's a few little crystal holds up there that you have to locate, but you really need to put your New River Gorge hat on to think your way through that one and be patient and solve the puzzle. It's not your standard Red River Gorge route, that's for sure, but it sure is classic.
Yeah.
Oh, it shut me down, which is great. I'm going to go back there. All right, this isn't about me. This is about the grades. We're moving into 512. 512 is another great grade at the Red River Gorge, and hard to narrow down, Kris.
Wow, I don't even know what I would say here. I will start with my favorite off the beaten path 512 is going to be the Gift at Longwall. It's a bolted slab to an overhang and looks improbable from the ground, but has really incredible climbing. That would be my vote for the best off the beaten path 12A. I love Swedish Fish in terms of long, pumpy, adventure style sport climbing. But then, geez, there are just hundreds of incredible 12As, Bs, C, all the 12s. They're all good. Do them all.
Is there a Kris Hampton route in the 12s that you would recommend?
No, they would all be trad routes. No, they would be off-wits, and no, that's my second off-wit. That's the last time.
That's it. You've done your 2.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to be jumping ahead here, but then Eric, I'll kick it over to you. But, one on my list, probably not surprising to the audience who's been following along, is Jesus Wept, which is a 12D at the sanctuary. And you have a different start to that?
Yeah, start to Jesus Wept called Atlas Shrugged, which is maybe
Atlas
a touch
Shrugged.
harder than Jesus Wept, and just climbs a neat feature into it at 12D, I think.
It looks like the logical start. So for anybody who goes out there and wants to check out these, like Atlas Shrugged it's the logical line of Jesus Wept, but Jesus starts to
If you're a trad climber, that's where your eyes go.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah,
Isn't there
exactly.
isn't there a little dihedral
yeah.
there? And so Kris is the former trad climber, or maybe not former, but I mean, recognize that you are a great crack climber. That your eyes probably were looking at that saying, why didn't they bolt here?
Went right to it. That's exactly what happened. I love the original start, but I had to look at that dihedral.
Yeah, it's an amazing route. The top of Jesus Wept is really hard to beat, very technical and balletic, if that's a word. Eric, how about you? I've got a couple more that I'll throw in, but let's come to you for the 512s, Eric.
Yeah, well, Jesus Wept was on the top of my list for 12s. Again, you can name a bunch of routes like Tuna Town or AO8, but probably at Motherlode, I would say 8 Ball, which is, again, this close to maybe being 13A, but 8 Ball is a wonderful route.
Incredible.
And actually left of that, I just did a route a year or two ago that I had walked by for years called, I think it's Swahili Slang.
Oh yeah, that was going to be one of my off
which
style.
is a 12C, and it's basically a Nerva Gorge route. So I loved
good.
it because, it's quite different for the red, and it felt hard because of that, because you kind of have your red River Gorge mindset for getting on it, and it doesn't work. You kind of like Prime Directive. You need to kind of think differently.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'll avoid that one. Appreciate the shout out. Okay, the only couple that I'll add to your already fantastic list is, and we touched on this earlier, is Mercy the Huff, which gets
Incredible.
a 12B, and it's at left flank, and it feels hard for the grade, but God, is it
Absolutely
good. It's just so good. My first 12A, a route called Check Your Grip at Drive By.
That's one of my favorites.
Yeah, such good movement. Ends up being like a really popular warm-up for the harder things over there, but it stands on its own as a fantastic route. Yep. And then I'm going to throw on one on here that I haven't climbed, but that I am excited to climb because I bolt-to-bolted it recently and loved the big kind of gymnastic movement, and that's Cell Block 6, which gets 12C.
Incredible. That whole wall is great.
That whole wall is great. Correct.
What is the left version of Dogleg? What's that called?
Demon Seed.
Demon Seed.
That is great.
Incredible.
That's better than Dogleg.
Better, for sure.
I think it's better, yeah. It's amazing.
12C,
12C is a stacked grade. I'm just like, maybe because I'm in that zone right now, but like I just, Stain and Malice and what's the one at Purgatory, Hellraiser? Or so, I mean, like there's just
Orange Juice.
12C's crazy.
Yeah, go check out Mirage at Muir Valley.
Oh yes, Solarium has a million kind of mid 12s, like right along it from Abby Yo-Yo to Super Best Friends and Magnum Opus and all that. So okay, well we've covered the 12s pretty well.
Boy,
but those are all.
Have we?
We haven't. We've touched on the 12s. We'll do a whole other episode on climbing 512 at the Red. In fact, you've got a preparation for that, Kris. And I will say that you and Nate Drolet did, this is quite a while ago, but it's easy to find in your pantheon of podcasts, kind of a Red River prep episode.
Yeah,
you
What, When, How to
list.
Train is what it's called.
Yeah, What, When, How to Train. And Drew Mack has a list of his favorites of every grade that I've gone through myself. So we're scratching the surface here, but you can do a deeper dive on the Power Company podcast. But let's move into the 513s, an area where I can't contribute much aside from the Force, which we've already talked about. And it should be on the list.
Which is a classic, yeah.
Yeah, but you all have climbed many more of these. So Kris, and probably another hard one to narrow down because there's such stellar 13s.
Yeah, 13A, 13B in the red is so good. Golden Boy, if you can get the conditions right, is incredible. for out of the way, incredible 513 Appalachian Spring at Funk Rock City is really good. I think Buttercup is one of my favorites at the Chocolate Factory at, I think, 13C. And then Swingline, I think, has a big piece of my heart. I've spent more time falling off of Swingline than maybe any other route, and just an incredible 13 plus at the dark side. So
no doubt. There's a lot along that wall of the dark side that are super high quality, and Darth Maul, and there's basically that whole line there are just look incredible. And the photo of you on the James Maples book, I think, was on Swingline, isn't it?
Yep, it is. I would say it's harder to find a bad 513 in the red than a good one. You can throw a rock and hit a good 513 in the red.
Totally.
There's so many.
Yeah,
Eric, you're like the second go king of kind of in the 13 minus range, and have climbed up into 13C as well. What are your favorites?
Well, Kris mentioned a bunch of them. Appalachian Spring I just did last year. That thing was wonderful.
So good.
A big move on it. For a shorter climber, I think it would be quite stout for the grade. For me, it felt right. Next to Jesus Wept is Prometheus Unbound, which is fantastic. It's just slightly harder version of Jesus Wept. And also last year I did Death by Chocolate, which I found to be really hard. I found it to be harder than most of the 13As for me. A few holds have broken coming out of that mid-route rest. There's a real definitive crux there now, but you have to hang on all the way to the chains. It's really long. It might be 120 feet of climbing. Long sweeping diagonal at the Chocolate Factory. Amazing route. I think one of the most unique or memorable, let's put it, 13As that I did is a route that probably isn't known so well by a lot of people, but it's called Name Dropper. It's actually on the far left side of the sanctuary. And the reason it's memorable is it has a really cool crux at mid-height. You can kind of a technical, underclinging, weird, thin move crux. But then there's the most in-your-face red point crux, literally the last
right at the chains,
to get to the. Do you remember that, Kris?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, people fall there over. I mean, kind of like what Ryan described on the Force. It's one of those routes you could red point it to the last move and fall going to the clipping hold. And thankfully I did not. I second go in it, but I found it to be really quite hard. And it's one of those routes where I practiced the end many, many times just to make sure if I got there, I could do it. Oh, and I have to say Kaleidoscope, which is one of the hardest routes I've done. And Angry Birds. Yeah, those are both 13C world class, in my opinion.
Yeah, some great ones over on that side of Drive By. Kaleidoscope is like such a striking feature of that crag there. Well, yeah, you guys have outclimbed me in this episode here, so I can't add anything to the 13s, but I'm excited to try some of the routes that you all just mentioned.
Can I add a shout out to the routes you probably don't want to try because they're that same off style? The Brilliant Orange is an incredible 13A. Mostly kind of slab vert climbing with a potential big dyno at the finish. And No Redemption is a very New River-esque sort of 13B. And then I think also at the 13B grade that's sort of New River-ish is Take That Katie Brown. All not the same like paddling Red River style that people think of when they think of the red, but just incredible routes.
I appreciate that. This pushes us into 514, an area that I would aspire to, but maybe
it counts me out.
Yeah, but there are classics, whether we've climbed them or coached climbers on them, or just as I've done a lot, which is just I've hung out at these areas. This is a rest day activity that I recommend for people, which is just get your little portable chair and go sit under some of these amazing routes. And Kris, what comes to mind in the 514 range?
Well, I mean, certainly Transworld Depravity is my favorite in the grade because it's the one I've spent the most time on and that I've done. And I would say God's Own Stone gets a bad rap. It's a really incredible rock climb. And I think it gets a bad rap because it suits the shorter climber. And, a 12-year-old's going to walk it in your face, but really an incredible rock climb. And then, of course, the Pure Imagination panel and those routes, Golden Ticket. Pure Imagination is accessible, even if you're a 513 climber who wants to know what 14C or B or whatever it is feels like. It's an accessible route to try, as are Omaha Beach and Transworld Depravity. So I think if you're looking into the 514s, the red is a really special place to go because you can do a lot of moves on 514 and see what it's going to feel like. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Eric, your boys, Cam and Jonathan, have done many a 514 at the red up to 14D. And while maybe you haven't spent a lot of time on them yourself, to add to Kris's list, any 514s that climbers should consider getting on or just going to watch the pros be on?
Yeah, well, I mean, the quote entry level 14A at the red is Zookeeper. Unfortunately, it's closed. And I should add, when it was originally put up, like the first 3 ascents were done from a much lower position. So it was not entry level. It was like 14B, the way Andrew Gearing did it, and then Jimmy Webb, and then my son Cameron did the 3rd ascent of it. And they all did it from a lower start. In years since, these blocks have got stacked where you skip the starting boulder. And so now it's like a soft A. And it's something that I was aspiring to begin working on this season. Unfortunately, that can't happen. Right next to it, there's a short 9A, a 14D, that's only been done a few times, that was bolted, I think, by Adam Taylor, perhaps, maybe 8 or 10 years ago. And Alex Megos fired off the FA. And it's pretty amazing because, my son Cameron did actually the 3rd set of it. And you step off the ground and you do just 25 feet of hard bouldering, unrelenting bouldering for 5 bolts. It ends with a jump to the top. It's just spectacular to watch as a viewer because the whole thing goes down in like under 90 seconds. And it's just pure effort. It's a shame that it's closed, but it's kudos to Adam for seeing that line because it looks improbable. And then, of course, Alex came in and opened it up. So it's one of the harder routes at the red. There's a few 14D routes at the red, and there are, I believe, maybe in the next 3 months, maybe a couple of 15s at the red. But we'll see how that plays out.
We'll have to extend this episode at which point 515, long overdue 515s are put up at the red, and I will be happy to armchair quarterback anything harder than what I climb. It's just fun to talk about these things. Guys, what an awesome list and a great conversation. I really appreciate you all bringing your expertise, your experience, and just your passion for Red River Gorge climbing here. Both of you have been incredible ambassadors for the Red, putting up first ascents, developing, bolting, and helping the greater community to get excited about and access the Red. So thank you both for doing that. There's many bright days ahead with all of the new stuff coming online. Yeah. So we'll have to do another one of these maybe in a year or so, and we can talk about the new favorites that we've got here at the Red. But I really want to thank you for your time, and I hope we can tie in real soon. Perhaps this fall, the 3 of us can get some pitches in together.
That'd be so fun.
That'd be great. Yeah, it's a great conversation. Thanks, guys. Let's do some climbing. Less podcasting, more climbing,
Agreed.
All right, y'all, that wraps up this climber's guide to the Red River Gorge. Are you sufficiently psyched to come out and wreck your forearms on some of that steep sandstone? I hope you are. And if you do come on out, hit me up. Let me know if you've got any questions for route recommendations that go beyond the list that we just shared there, which was, we scratched the surface, but there's about a million other amazing routes at the Red. So feel free to hit me up. Or Eric or Kris, for that matter. I'm sure they'd be happy and psyched to let you know what they've been loving on their tick list out there. And then, maybe I'll run into you. And in fact, I would love to run into you. Again, I will be out at Rocktoberfest this year doing a live podcast at Miguel's on October 8th with Kai Leitner, Emily Harrington, and Anna Hazelnut. So come on out on October 8th to see me for that, and then stick around for the festival. I'll be around the entire time. You can get tickets for that and learn more at the RRGCC site. I'm putting that link in the show notes. I'm also putting a link in the show notes for the Power Company Red River Pump Prep that Kris is so generously hooking listeners up for any time of year. If you just want to build incredible fitness and that resistance to pump, regardless of where you're going, but especially for the Red, I recommend this course. It just loads right into your phone. Anyway, I don't get anything out of it. I'm not like getting a cut or whatever, but it's awesome that Kris is hooking it up. So check the show notes for that. Check show notes for a special discount for PhysiVantage products so that you can fight the pump from the inside as well as the outside. And Rhino Skin Solutions and everything else. All the sponsors that take care of the struggle are also taking care of you by giving you a really nice discount. So appreciate you supporting them because they support me. So yeah, check your show notes for that. I hope your training and your climbing are going great. Shout out to Glenn Walker for helping me edit these episodes and everybody else who supports The Struggle. If you want bonus content and if you want to support The Struggle in an even greater way, I would love for you to do that. Pop on over to patreon.com/The Struggle Climbing Show. Come on aboard as a Patreon member. You'll get over 100 hours at your immediate disposal. Pro clinics with the biggest names in the sport, covering topics like stronger fingers, better endurance, techniques and tactics to boulder and sport climb better. All of those pro clinics will be immediately available to you as a Patreon member, plus all sorts of other bonus content. So anyway, appreciate your support. Swing on over to Patreon for that. And what else? I guess that's it. I'm actually going to go climbing. I'm recording this right now so that I can run out and get some laps in at the Red in preparation for the fall season. So yeah, I hope you're having an awesome season. Thank you again for your support, and I'll see you next week.